Most of what we've learned comes from the Great Basin, but some of it is very applicable to the Gunnison Basin. The work stems from our postdocs, master's level specialists, and clinicians, some of whom are shown here in this photo. We've worked for over a decade on these problems, and we're working hard to avoid what is shown in this photo here, which is conversion of perennial plant communities into annual grasslands. These annual grasslands are prone to fire, they have lower productivity, generally less suitable for wildlife or livestock production, and most people agree that we want to avoid this. What can we do? Well, we can resist the change using these types of treatments, such as passive adjustments to the stressors that we think exacerbate cheatgrass and medusa head and other exotic annuals. Or we can use pre-emergent herbicides such as imazapic, which are added to soil to inhibit seeds or seedling survival. We can use plantings of desirable perennials that can compete with cheatgrass where we think the perennials are insufficient in abundance. In bigger areas, planting won't work, so we've got to seed, sometimes using drill seedings. Soil treatments are oftentimes useful. We can also use these tools to direct the change towards some sort of tolerable mid-condition. That might be, for example, seeded annual grasslands like is shown here inside this exclosure. These are not totally ideal for wildlife, but in some cases they are better than having cheatgrass. In some cases, these buffers, these perennial grasslands may make nice buffer between intact habitat and degraded habitat. And all too often, we've accepted the changes for many decades, and that has led to the condition of the Great Basin. Well, how well do these resistance efforts work? Some studies, like this Knudsen paper, have done surveys across many, in this case 100 different historic treatments. And a number of these studies indicate that success has been limited. In other words, aerial seedings of wildland collected sagebrush or drill seeding of perennial bunch grasses or spraying of herbicides are not generating the long-term success that people would like to see, which contributes to the low condition of many of the invaded habitats over decades. More recently, studies are sharpening the way that we look for success. Number one, by appreciating that the recovery of these landscapes is generally patchy. And we can learn something from patches of success compared to other areas. So before I get too farther, I want to just tell you the main points here. We've really got to think about where we are applying treatments and how we're measuring the success. I'll talk a little bit more about the concept of resistance to annual grass invasion and resilience to disturbance. Those two things are very intertwined. And the underlying factors that give you resistance and resilience are the integrity of your plant community, particularly the abundance and the health of key perennial herbs, especially perennial bunch grasses. Those species have relatively deep roots, they can endure drought, and they can compete to some degree with cheatgrass. All too often, we've seen that interventions have been one and done, single entry types of seedings or herbicide sprayings that in the long run probably could have been as successful if they were applied in the right year, which sometimes is just a probability thing of hitting the right weather with your treatments. Generally, we need to use an adaptive management approach of applying some of the treatments, observing the outcomes, and reapplying treatments if necessary, and doing this in an integrative pest management type of approach that holistically is both addressing the symptoms of the invasion of the problem, which is the weed invasion, and the underlying causes, which may be things like grazing or other stresses. Now, knowing if you've been successful or not is not trivial. We're still trying to develop good metrics for success in these restoration investments and how to monitor for them, especially over large areas. There will always be new technologies brought to the table for such large problems like cheatgrass. Some of them are proven and some are less proven. We've observed some land managers be inefficient with their time and effort and funding, and sometimes trying to be the first to test technologies like, for example, weed suppressive bacteria that aren't quite proven yet. So as I give this presentation, let's think about what from the Great Basin is transferable to the Gunnison area. Notably, in the Gunnison area, you've got higher elevation areas, mountains, shrublands, or mountain-based sagebrush, which generally are wetter. They have a pretty good amount of perennial herbs, and therefore they are fairly robust to disturbances. A wildfire sweeps through, and the following year, you've got a pretty good rebound of your perennial herbs. And that recovery to disturbance is critical for resistance to cheatgrass because it shortens the window of opportunity for cheatgrass to actually invade. A lot of these high elevation areas don't really merit investment because they can probably recover pretty well on their own and resist cheatgrass, at least under the current climates. However, at the lowest elevations, resistance and resilience is so weak that if you're going to intervene, you might need to be ready to have a fairly extended program of lots of retreatments in order to achieve success. Generally, the current paradigm is that these middle resistance resilience classes, moderate climates, for example, moderate within the sagebrush steppe domain, are where landscapes both merit treatment and they are likely to respond positively to them without excessive investments. Now, let's look at some of the outcomes of different types of treatments. One notable one here is right in Colorado, northwest Colorado, Browns Park National Wildlife Refuge. Livestock were excluded from the refuge starting in the late 1990s, and we were able to find a data set where in 2007 line point intercept techniques were used, and we had pretty good information on the amount of cheatgrass cover, biocrusts, biological soil crusts, and perennial bunch grasses. Biological soil crusts, by the way, refer to the mosses, lichens, and other organisms that are right on the soil surface. We don't think about them very much in terms of cheatgrass, but there's a lot of evidence, including this data shown here, that tells us that these biocrusts are pretty good competitors with cheatgrass. So here, for example, looking back in time, we can see that the probability of these landscapes going either from bare soil to becoming cheatgrass invaded or becoming cheatgrass invaded towards cheatgrass dominated, it decreases the more crust you've had initially in 2007 when livestock grazing stopped. Same thing for perennial bunchgrass cover, negative relationship. In contrast, those plots that had at least 20% cheatgrass cover start back in 2007 were kind of doomed for the next few decades in terms of cheatgrass was just going to continue increasing regardless of the fact that livestock had been pulled off. So this is pretty insightful. Number one, thresholds. Number two, even though you've relieved the area of livestock grazing stress, there's so much cheatgrass invasion occurring all around that cheatgrass is still going to race in and try to compete, try to get an edge on the biocrust and the perennial bunch grasses. So what can be done? We're currently working with Browns Park to figure out areas where there's enough perennial bunch grasses and enough of a threat of cheatgrass so we can go in and intervene now and maybe reduce some of the spread. Biological crusts, we've learned a lot of new things very recently. We worried that herbicides like imazapic might damage biological crusts. And in fact, we're seeing quite the opposite. This is really promising for us. Here, for example, you can see imazapic, the ratio of biocrust to exotic annual grasses for imazapic applied in 2017 or in 2018. 2018 was a wetter year. And here what you can see is that the biocrust increased quite a bit for the herbicide, for the more successful herbicide application. And the herbicides often only give you a few years of reduction of cheatgrass or other exotic annuals, whereas the biocrust, once present, could give you many years, maybe decades or centuries of pretty good control. So this is fairly promising, exciting. Now, in these same kind of areas where you've lost a lot of your perennials due to overgrazing or other stresses, how can you combine pre-emergent herbicides and seed for the seed of the native perennials that you're trying to restore? Not a trivial problem. One strategy is to try to separate these treatments in time. Here, I'll show you some data on this. For the soda wildfire on the Oregon-Idaho border, burned in 2017, these treatments went in. For example, here we've got herbicide sprayed in 2015, shown in this gray line, and then plots where herbicide right after the fire was followed by drill seeding of perennial bunch grasses a year later. And here you can see over the long run where the drill seeding was added on top of the herbicide spraying. You've got quite a bit less exotic annual grasses, notably keeping the treatments keep the abundance of cheatgrass below what we consider to be a 20% threshold. Keeping below that threshold helps ensure that cheatgrass won't run away and come to dominate the site down the road. Perennial bunch grasses, the opposite. That herbicide followed by drill seeding led to a really nice increase. It got us more than 20% perennial bunch grasses. This site is very likely to have perennial bunch grasses in the future as a result of this high abundance. What if we use the alternative, the opposite strategy, and we drill seed first and then spray? Again, lots of plots. We have a similar kind of outcome where the combined treatment is reducing cheatgrass and increasing perennial bunch grasses, but the effect is not nearly as good as the converse, spray then drill. So I'm just giving you examples of the types of information that are coming forward that I think are practically useful. Another key thing is what kind of herbicide to use. So imazapic has been the workhorse, and Dazaflam, otherwise known as Redruva, the old trade name was Esplanade, is now on the market. And people are excited about it because it's, number one, a true pre-emergent, but number two, it's expected to last quite a bit longer in soil than imazapic. This is critical because perennial bunch grasses need lots of years to recover before they're ready to compete with cheatgrass. So here we've applied the treatments in these 1 acre large strips across many different plant community patch types, kind of a mosaic of areas that were skeleton weed communities with cheatgrass, or small Poa bulbosa, bulbous bluegrass, an exotic annual community, and then of course the cheatgrass stands. And here what you can see is that imazapic was a lot less effective than was indaziflam or Redruva. Here you can see a lot bigger reduction compared to the control plots, especially for a year that was a little bit wetter. And the combination of the treatments was also very, very promising. And then really exciting, if you take a look at these treatment effects as they vary by patch type, you can see that some patch types exhibited a lot stronger response. So that's exciting. If we can recalibrate our criteria for success and focus on those hotspots, we can paint a different picture as to what's working and why. Here's another site on the Idaho Transportation Department right-of-ways. We did lots of experiments with the same types of chemicals, including bioherbicides that come from bacteria. Here's the density of cheatgrass and control bioherbicide in Dazaflam, again, Redruva, really strongly knocked down. Imazapic by itself, not quite as good as a Redruva, and the combination of the two. And here also, you can see that we've raked in blue or left unraked in green treatments. So this is raking away litter that might include the contact of herbicides to the soil. Here's yet another experiment, 1,000 acres along Minidoka National Wildlife Refuge. The managers worked with us to do a trial that had both untreated indaziflam sprayed or indaziflam plus imazapic. Here again, you can see a really strong reduction in cheatgrass cover. The untreated areas at almost 35% cheatgrass cover, that's a problem. These untreated plots probably going to increase in cheatgrass over time. Whereas indaziflom is able to bring the cheatgrass covered almost to below the threshold. And of course, the combination of the two really works strongly. And then conversely, again, where we've seen cheatgrass get reduced, we're seeing really nice recovery of perennial grasses here, almost up to that 20% threshold that we would really like to see. Now, seeding is a problem. On all those experiments I just showed you, they all had seedings and all the seedings failed. Well, why is that? Are we using the right seed at the right time in the right place? That's a key question. One of the key things for seeds, especially in areas like the Gunnison Basin, are going to be, are you using natives? And I want to point out that there's a gradient of nativeness. You can have truly local seed sources. You might have the right species, but perhaps you're getting seed from off-site or from a farm, from a vendor who increased the seeds on a farm. Or you might have cultivars of the natives that have been bred. Or you might have species like crested wheatgrass or forage kochia that are truly non-native. The non-natives have been used extensively in the Great Basin because they are cheap and they appear to establish better, at least initially. But here we've got sampling done over this huge area that's showing us that the native mixes, they may be slow to get established, but in the long run, they may actually establish better in terms of producing more bunchgrass cover. And this sort of finding has been found elsewhere in single sites in Utah. To help you pick the right seeds, there are new software, online tools that you can use that will match climate for you. We've done experiments where we take the seed sources, plant them together in common gardens, look at who survives and who doesn't survive, which one grows bigger, smaller, which seed sources. And then from that, we can know something about their climate adaptation, take that information and produce the seed zone guidances that are really useful, strongly recommended. But in this age of global warming, we'll always wonder about could we or should we be using seeds from warmer and drier areas, for example? Well, there might be some merit to that idea. Here, for example, is a map showing different seeds stripped onto the 180,000 acres of the Soda wildfire. Years later, there was more seedlings in those strips where the seeds came from drier and warmer areas. Maybe a case for assisted migration. People have also thought about using C4 grasses that are more drought resistant or shrubs from lower elevations. These are really controversial ideas. One thing we can do, though, is time our treatments a little bit better with favorable weather. That's made possible by tools such as the USGS land treatment exploration tool, a digital thing online, easy to use. You put a polygon around your site. You can very quickly get all of these information sources for your site. And in addition, really detailed forecast of soil moisture availability for the near future based on some simulation data. Pretty valuable tools, I would say. So I've presented to you a number of different factors that I think are useful in considering what kinds of treatments and interventions could be useful in a place like Gunnison Basin. These items are listed out here. They can also be arranged in the decision support tree. Okay, I think I'm out of time. Thank you very much.